Hello, my name is Marie. I'm a PhD student at QUT, and today I'm going to share with you a little bit about my PhD study, which has looked at leadership in early childhood. And I'm going to begin by sharing with you a little bit about the impetus that began my research. So my study emerged from my experiences in being a leader in early childhood. I've worked in the sector now for about 19 years, most recently as the director of a community kindergarten for the last 8. My experiences working as a teacher and director during times of significant change for the sector has been both rich and invigorating, while also being complicated and at times tense and fraught. I often felt torn between leading in ways that felt right for myself and my context, with the good leadership that I read about in early childhood texts. These mixed feelings provided the impetus for my study into leadership in early childhood. I came to this research looking to add something different to the story of early childhood leadership. I wasn't looking to add to the how-to guides or even to the already large scholarship on models and styles of leadership that have been borrowed from business and organizational theory. Leadership has been key to early childhood policy and the assumed vehicle for delivering a broad range of outcomes for children and families in early childhood. The introduction of policy agendas, such as the Early Years Learning Framework and the National Quality Framework, have created a shifting landscape for early childhood, for which leaders have been responsible for responding to for now more than 10 years. It's timely that questions have been raised about how leadership is being produced in the context of changing early childhood landscapes. My study makes a contribution to understanding leadership by problematizing notions of good leadership. An in-depth review of the literature looked to leadership theories and discourses of early childhood leadership to arrive at the research question for my study: how do early childhood leaders produce understandings about good leadership? The research question sought to explore the discursive construction of leadership in early childhood. Viewing leadership as a discourse means to see it as just one way of talking about leadership, but not the only or necessary one. In my study, the term good was also not considered natural or neutral. Everyone has an opinion about good and bad leaders and what constitutes successful or unsuccessful leadership. Through the research question, my study sought to question dominant and taken for granted understandings of good leadership. The study was framed by a post-structuralist orientation and drew on Foucauldian theory to map possible readings of early childhood leadership. Foucault's work on discourse, power, knowledge, regimes of truth, and governmentality informed the inquiry. I also looked to the work of others whose post-structural feminist theorizing assisted me in interrogating the ways that early childhood leadership is produced. Bringing concepts such as gender to the study of leadership answers the call of those who argue that bringing identity issues to the surface make visible the complex ways in which gender is made invisible by dominant discourses. The data was generated through a method called collective biography. Collective biography is a form of memory work conducted by groups of people investigating topics of interest through sharing memory stories. Myself and 6 other early childhood leaders participated in 3 3-hour collective biography workshops in which memories of leadership were shared in response to a stimulus question for each workshop. In order to analyse the data that I gathered through the workshops, notions of good early childhood leadership were problematised through a particular method of discourse analysis. The development and application of categories informed the data analysis. Irony provided a rhetorical and playful tool to look at how seemingly opposing discourses are held together. The data was organised by drawing on the concept of relationships. Each chapter covered a number of memory stories, and each chapter is connected by stories that focus on particular relationships. With the limited time we have here today, I'm going to provide a closer look at how I conducted the analysis of just one memory story in particular. Now to the data analysis. I'll share the readings that I made about leadership when analysing different relationships. The words that are emboldened highlight the mechanics of the discourse analysis process. After numerous readings of each story, words or phrases thought to indicate a discourse were highlighted with coloured post-it notes, indicated here by the emboldened words. These worked as signposts to assist me in making connections across the stories. The story that I'm going to unpack was told by Lisa and recalls a time when she was called a despicable person by a parent. Lisa is an owner and director of a small long daycare centre. This story focused on a time when she needed to respond to a complaint from a parent. In opening the story, Lisa's assertion that the circumstances were insignificant immediately diminishes the matter raised by the parent. Drawing on the discursive rule that in order for someone's actions to be reasonable, their reaction needs to be proportionate to the circumstance, the parent's actions are positioned as unreasonable. Wet pants was simply not a valid reason to legitimate the harsh way in which Lisa was spoken to. As her story went on, Lisa described her attempts to communicate with the parent. Choosing to speak face-to-face as opposed to something so impersonal as over the phone was a more discursively permissible option. Focusing on her warm and helpful style of communication makes it even more inconceivable that Lisa could be called despicable. There was a regime of truth that early childhood leaders and parents should have respectable and harmonious relationships. Calling Adele despicable resists this regime of truth. Lisa's ongoing struggle to make sense of being called despicable leads her to surmise about the differences between herself and this parent. Discourses of professionalism make it sayable that an owner of a centre such as Lisa should draw on her professional and pedagogical knowledge to make the changes at her centre that she spoke of. Relying strongly on her sense of professionalism, that is her specialist body of knowledge, Lisa was able to assume a position of status and authority, which leaves little room for the parent's view to be validated. Discourses of change also make it sayable that implementing change is a natural, inevitable, and desirable aspect of early childhood leadership. This justification not only supports Lisa's positioning of herself, but enables a certain way of speaking about the parent, that is, as someone who is resistant to change and someone who just doesn't get it. Lisa's exercise of authority works to create a new object of knowledge, that is, the parent who doesn't know. As a business owner and an early childhood leader, Lisa has both knowledge of operating a business as well as knowledge about the importance of early years pedagogy. Through these understandings, Lisa positions herself within the category of an expert. The parent is simultaneously positioned in the category of non-expert. Early childhood leaders, as people who possess important bodies of knowledge, and parents who don't get it, are spoken as regimes of truth. Good leadership is thus spoken as involving the deployment of professional and pedagogical knowledge to make necessary changes. In this way, the parents' harsh treatment of Lisa, as well as their lack of appropriate knowledge, makes the comments towards Lisa not only undeserved, but unwarranted. In this data chapter, irony was drawn on to hold together competing and colliding discourses. Good leadership with parents is spoken in ways that are sometimes forceful, yet also collaborative. Being forcefully collaborative brings together the image of an early childhood leader who in relationships with parents is assertive, decisive, and forthright, with another who is collaborative, warm, and friendly. Ironic thinking brings together seemingly opposing ideas such as force and collaboration, allowing them to exist together in tension and allowing ways for understanding the complexities of leadership that are otherwise not easily expressed. Another data chapter examines stories about relationships with colleagues. Communicating and relating to colleagues is a core aspect of early childhood leadership. Discourses of relationships both enabled and constrained how good leadership was produced. This was examined by looking to the unspoken rules or ways that leaders rationalise their work. Working collaboratively as part of a team, developing a collegial atmosphere and supporting others are some of the normative expectations that direct leaders' relationships with colleagues. Of particular note in relation to colleagues was the articulation of tensions and frustrations by leaders. This tension points to some of the complexity for early childhood leaders in navigating the discourses that are available to them. They don't sit neatly or easily alongside one another, but rather compete, collide, and intersect, producing good leadership in complex and sometimes in unexpected ways. The ironic category of diplomatically bossy captures some of this complexity. Early childhood leaders are caught in and between, somehow being both supportive and directive in their relationships with colleagues. The leaders in my study were highly uncomfortable with notions of unilateral power associated with being the boss and telling people what to do. Gendered assumptions underpinning leadership discourses produce women in leadership as needing to be the boss, but not too bossy. This is problematic. To be successful leaders, women need to be both supportive and directive with colleagues. The ironic category of diplomatically bossy captures some of this tension. The final data chapter looked to relationships with authorities such as bosses and regulatory authorities. Collegiality and teamwork were familiar and comfortable discourses for early childhood leaders. Yet there are times when leaders need to be assertive and direct with authorities. What Harper described as being hardline. Being decisive, assertive, or direct, typically masculine leadership traits, is difficult for women leaders. The regime of truth is that as leaders, women need to display the type of feminine attributes and behaviours that are permitted within the discourse. What one of the participants, Harper, described as being warm and fuzzy. Memories of relationships with authorities suggest that early childhood leaders have access to knowledge such as the law, which bosses, as non-experts, do not. Power is assigned through the category of leader as someone who has expert knowledge of laws and regulations. Regulatory bodies are positioned as non-experts on matters of early childhood pedagogies. Being willing to speak up creates a new kind of leadership category. That is early childhood leadership as fierce resistance. An ironic category that was read in the participants' talk was the reluctant heroine. Positional discourses produce leadership as needing to direct from the front like a ship's captain. Accordingly, power and authority are located in positions such as directors and educational leaders. The participants in this study draw on positional discourses when talking about good leadership in relationship with authorities, but they do so with a level of reluctance as they recognise that stepping outside of the discursive boundaries of being supportive, nice, and collegial carries the risk of being labelled outliers, renegades, or cowboys, as one of the participants, Eliza, feared, or as too radical, as another participant, Adele, did. The method of data generation and analysis allowed for new understandings and possibilities in relation to good early childhood leadership. Discourses of educational and pedagogical leadership strongly influence perceptions of good early childhood leadership. Early childhood leaders are responsible for delivery of educational and pedagogical outcomes within and across relationships with children, families, and staff. This is not simple or straightforward. The participant stories demonstrated that it is difficult for women leaders to draw on roles and hierarchies as a source of authority or influence. Discourses of professionalism, that is knowledge, experience, and qualifications, however, are acceptable and important sources of authority for early childhood leaders. Having appropriate knowledge of early childhood pedagogies is important. Being able to influence the actions of others with this knowledge is also important, but not easy or straightforward in practice. The memory stories made frequent references to encountering resistance and people who still, despite their leadership efforts, do not get it. Next were implications arising from positional and relational discourses of leadership. A striking feature in many of the stories was a sense of struggle over wanting to resist hierarchical ways of leading, yet feeling like this was required. Drawing on your position for authority, even if it was seen as unavoidable at times, was risky, and there were consequences for the early childhood leaders in doing so. Inclusive understandings of leadership, such as shared or distributed leadership, discursively produce leadership that is concerned with relationships. Being supportive, collaborative, and one of the team is a more familiar discourse for early childhood leaders, yet also was not without trouble. Gendered discourses enabled and constrained the production of good early childhood leadership. What was apparent in all of the stories was a tension between heroic, masculine leadership discourses and feminine discourses that shape early childhood teaching. The participants acknowledged the need to be assertive, direct, and decisive, yet somehow at the same time warm, nice, and friendly. What is most significant about these findings is that it appears not much has changed since Louise Hart in 2005 found a discourse of niceness to pervade interpretations of leadership. In fact, the discourse of nice ladies was first coined more than 25 years ago. There's a clear need for further attention towards discourses of gender in early childhood leadership. Power was generally absent in discussions of leadership. The absence of explicit talk about power suggests a regime of truth in regards to early childhood leadership. When it was spoken, however, power was understood as something possessed and deployed. Associations between discourses of power and hierarchy made it something that early childhood leaders tend to avoid. What this thesis has contributed is a different consideration of power and governmentality, offering new ways of thinking about early childhood leadership. Governmentality as the conduct of conduct provided a way of interrogating the memory stories, which made it possible to suggest that power was in fact prevalent in participant discussions of leadership. This offers a perspective of connections between power and leadership, which is not currently available in much of the early childhood leadership literature. Finally, this study offers a new methodological contribution as the first piece of empirical research drawing on collective biography to investigate early childhood leadership. This research does not declare knowledge about good early childhood leadership that is any more true than what is currently available in the field. Rather, the practices of collective biography offer something different, a possibility to consider early childhood leadership in different ways. That is, a truth that is worked on through the practices of telling and listening. The methods of collective biography have offered new possibilities for exploring the discursive production of leadership and immense potential for exploring other early childhood topics in a similar manner. The insights gleaned through this methodology allow the interrogation of tensions and contradictions, while also allowing for the messiness and complexities of leadership to be explored. Embracing complexity and messiness allows for insights that may otherwise be lost in the push to tidy up research findings and draw final conclusions. The implications from this research offer possibilities for future research that may enrich understandings of early childhood leadership. Persistent references to early childhood policy, such as national laws, regulations, and assessment regimes, and the tension associated with leading according to these, indicates possibilities for future research. There are also possibilities for research that looks to those outside of formal leadership positions and their perceptions of good leadership. One element of the data analysis that was particularly striking was the level of frustration and distress conveyed in memories of leadership. This suggested that matters of early childhood workforce are particularly important for future research. The emotional turmoil conveyed in some stories seemed at odds with the length of time that practitioners worked in the field and the fact that they continue to do so. I wrote up the conclusions for this study in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. Operating in this space of being at once a PhD researcher, a kindy director, and a practicing teacher gave me additional pause for thought about the cost of early childhood leadership that warrants sustained and urgent research focus. I hope that my work on early childhood leadership has given you some pause for thought about what good early childhood leadership means for you. And I look forward to continuing this conversation. Thanks for coming along today.